Hello and welcome to our September Coffee with the Curator talk. Thank you very much for joining us again today. As many of you will know, this series of talks began this January, and it's really to highlight some of the remarkable objects that we have in the Society's collection. My name's Helen Elletson, and I'm fortunate to be the Curator of Research and Development for the William Morris Society, and it's one of my roles to research and develop some of the collection items that we have. The William Morris Society was founded in 1955, and the Society was honoured to accept a very large donation of objects from the resident of Kelmscott House, Mrs. Helena Stevenson, before she passed away in the 1970s. And so the objects that we talk about in this series of talks relate to mostly her donation. She also gave the house to the William Morris Society, so it's almost like a ready-made museum she handed over. So this talk is a little bit different this month. We're looking at Kelmscott House because it ties in with open house that happens every September, although obviously slightly different during lockdown, but wanted to continue that theme by looking at Kelmscott House and focusing on the really interesting residents of the building. So I decided to call this month's talk "From the Inventor of the Electric Telegraph to a 100-year-old Actress, the Remarkable Residents of Kelmscott House." So we'll start by looking at our premises of the Society, as some of you may have already visited. This is Kelmscott House in Hammersmith. And although William Morris was the most famous person to live at this beautiful riverside property, in our coffee morning today, we'll also cover the intriguing stories of the other inhabitants who called Kelmscott House home. The first occupant in 1790 was a Colonel Ralph Winwood, who was succeeded by a James Smith. But the first notable inhabitant was Sir Francis Reynolds. In 1816, Reynolds constructed in the garden at Kelmscott House the very first electric telegraph. The garden was then nearly an acre long, and 8 miles of wire were suspended, looping back and forth. This overhead construction was superseded by a subterranean experiment, and this insulated cable has emerged over the years, being dug up accidentally by subsequent owners who were doing their gardening. And a portion of this electric telegraph is actually in the Society's collection, and it remains in the original display box, which states, "I will not comment on the interest of this specimen, but it should be kept for all time." And I do hope it will be. It's a little piece of wire with insulated glass tubing around it, and it's the oldest object we have in our collection, dating from 1816. And even though it's nothing to do with William Morris, which is the focus obviously of our collection, it's such an important piece, being so old and so full of history. So hopefully it will be kept for all time, as the finder requested. And when he presented his invention of the electric telegraph to the Admiralty, Reynolds was told that the electric telegraph was totally unnecessary, with semaphore being in common usage. And it wasn't until 2 years before he died that Reynolds received the recognition he deserved in the form of a knighthood. He went on to have a distinguished career as a meteorologist and became director of Kew Observatory. Sadly, Reynolds didn't take any copyright or patent out on his invention, and one of his young assistants, Charles Wheatstone, later teamed up with William Cooke, and they claimed the invention. So our poor Reynolds didn't get the credit he deserved. Morris's occupation of Kelmscott House will be recorded later, but it's interesting to note his views on Reynolds. When Morris was approached regarding the placing of a memorial stone to Reynolds on Kelmscott House when he was living there, it was recalled the suggestion met with wrath. Morris declared that for their brutalizing influence upon humans, telegraphs were as much to be blamed as railways. However, with Morris's full approval, the tablet was placed on the coach house. And when you visit Kelmscott House today, you can actually see that stone plaque commemorating Ronald's time. The autumn of 1867 brought George MacDonald, poet, minister and novelist, to Kelmscott House, which was then called The Retreat, along with his wife and their large family. MacDonald was a pioneering figure of modern fantasy literature and even regarded as the founding father of the genre. The Victorians became enthralled with classic fairy tales, and MacDonald's stories sold in huge numbers. He was a major literary influence on many notable writers, including J.M. Barrie, Mark Twain, Chesterton, C.S. Lewis, Edith Nesbit, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Lewis Carroll. And although no longer a household name like Morris, it has been argued that he was better known to the general reading public in his own time than Morris, and made a huge impact on those literary figures. In fact, C.S. Lewis wrote that he regarded MacDonald as his master, while G.K. Chesterton referred to him as one of the 3 or 4 greatest men of the 19th century, and he cited The Princess and the Goblin, a book written while MacDonald was at the retreat, as a book that had made a difference to my whole existence. However, MacDonald is best known as the literary mentor to Lewis Carroll. MacDonald is photographed here by Lewis Carroll with his eldest daughter, Lily, who was friends with Kate and Ellen Terry, the actresses. It was George MacDonald's advice and his children's enthusiasm for the story that encouraged Carroll to publish Alice's Adventures Underground, later renamed Alice in Wonderland. At the time, the manuscript was approximately half the size we know it today, and it was George MacDonald who encouraged Carroll to lengthen it. In fact, Greville MacDonald, the first of the children to become friends with Carroll, declared that there should be 60,000 volumes of it. Here he is, photographed by Carroll. Lewis Carroll was one of the finest Victorian photographers, and he created photographic portraits of all of MacDonald's children. Here we have, with Carroll himself, photographed with Louisa MacDonald and 4 of her children. As well as friendships with some of the greatest writers of the 19th century, the MacDonalds were also in the centre of artistic circles, and the artist to have the most impact on MacDonald was Arthur Hughes. It was in the year that MacDonald moved into the retreat that the collaboration between author and illustrator began. And here we can see Hughes's illustration for the front cover of one of MacDonald's books. Their working relationship was both successful and productive, resulting in Hughes producing over 200 illustrations for several of MacDonald's children's stories. MacDonald wrote 2 of his best-loved works during his occupation of his riverside home. At the Back of the North Wind, as we see here, in 1871, and The Princess and the Goblin a year later. The finest collaboration between MacDonald and Arthur Hughes was really the former, At the Back of the North Wind, and it's considered to be one of MacDonald's masterpieces. It has particular associations with the retreat, as the book is actually located at the house. The story involves a young boy named Diamond, who is befriended by the North Wind, who's actually a beautiful woman, and carried along on many adventures. Diamond's bedroom is located in the loft above the coach house at the retreat. And we also know in real life that the coach house was used for a time as a stable for the MacDonald's horse and their 2 Shetland ponies. Those of you who have visited Kelmscott House will be familiar with this adjoining coach house, where Morris would go on to house his Hammersmith Carpet workshops and later his socialist meetings, as we'll hear about later. MacDonald once commented, "I write not for children, but for the childlike, whether they be 5 or 75. The North Wind is a beautiful woman with long flowing pre-Raphaelite hair." And here we see Diamond clinging to her. Hughes was prolific in his illustrating and became a major figure in Victorian book illustration. Their new home was a great success with MacDonald and his family, consisting of his wife and their 11 children. In fact, the family was so large that it soon became necessary to take the small adjoining house, River Villa, in 1875. That's the small house adjoining next to number 26. So it's number 24, as you can see here. This offered the dual purpose of providing increased room for the MacDonalds and also enabling their great friends, Anne and Jane Cobden, the daughters of the Liberal MP Richard Cobden, to stay as house guests. Jane Cobden later became Jane Cobden Sanderson when she married Thomas James Sanderson, the bookbinder at the nearby Doves Bindery, and later co-founder with Emery Walker of the Doves Press. The Cobdens also give an additional link between the MacDonalds and the Morrises. Jane Cobden was Lillian MacDonald's greatest friend, and the Cobden Sandersons were very close friends of the Morrises, particularly Jane, who travelled with them to Italy in 1881. The MacDonalds were great entertainers. Plays were often performed at the house. A removable stage was erected on the lawn, and the coach house was converted into a theatre, complete with gaslit stage. Annual entertainments were given for Octavia Hill, founder of the National Trust, with numbers reaching almost 100 on occasion. Other visitors included many other prominent Victorians, such as the poet laureate Tennyson, who had to be rescued on boat race day from being swept up with the crowds on his way to the house. And as you can see here, this photograph is actually taken in 1892, after the MacDonalds had moved and Morris lived here, but you can still see the boat race guests all lining along the banks of the River Thames, Oxford and Cambridge going by on the river at the forefront here. Actually, at the moment, they go past Kelmscott House, and some very brave guests actually on the rooftop of Kelmscott House, the large house in the centre of our image here. Other visitors to the house when MacDonald lived here were Samuel Barnett, founder of Toynbee Hall, Edward Burne-Jones, John Ruskin, and as we've heard, Arthur Hughes and Lewis Carroll. Sadly, the MacDonalds gradually became convinced that their riverside home was to be blamed for the family's poor health. And it was for that reason that in 1877, the MacDonalds decided to leave the retreat and put the lease up for sale. It was Dante Gable Rossetti who, house hunting for himself, actually came across the retreat. His main objections to taking the property, though, centred on what he called the frightful kitchen and the belief that the house was liable to flooding. And his fears actually did prove founded when the house did flood in Morris's time. And around this time, Morris was also looking to move from Horrington House at Turnham Green, where he then lived. But unlike Rossetti, Morris immediately saw the house's potential. He believed that their friends would visit often, if only for the sake of the garden and river, he said. And it was also nearer to their great friends, the Burne-Joneses, at the Grange in Fulham. Morris said affectionately in a letter to his wife Jane, "So let us hope we shall all grow younger there, my dear." In less than a year after moving in, and once Morris had mastered the techniques, looms were brought into the coach house, and women were employed to hand knot these Hammersmith carpets. Here we have the Society's example here. Up until this time, hand-knotted carpets were not being manufactured in Britain at all, and the widest carpet frame here in the coach house was for a 12-foot carpet, and each of the 6 young women Morris employed was expected to knot 2 inches of carpet each day. And when completed, these rugs and carpets were often spread out on the lawn in the garden for Morris's inspection. The hammer symbol that you can see on the lower right-hand side of this carpet only appears on those Hammersmith carpets made actually in Kelmscott House. Even when he was away from the house, Morris longed to return to these practical crafts. As he wrote to Georgiana Burne-Jones in 1879, "Lord bless us, how nice it will be when I can get back to my little patterns and dyeing and the dear warp and weft at Hammersmith." So the Hammersmith carpets moved, when larger orders came in for bigger carpets, they moved from the coach house at Kelmscott House to Merton Abbey in 1881. And although they still retained the name Hammersmith Carpets, they no longer had the little hammer symbol. So if you ever see a Hammersmith carpet with that hammer, sometimes it has an M on the side for Morris, and also sometimes additionally wavy lines to signify the River Thames. So if you ever see that with one of those symbols, it was actually made in Hammersmith in Morris's home. The coach house is one of the most historically important rooms in Kelmscott House, as it was later converted from the Hammersmith carpet workshops into the meeting hall of the Hammersmith Socialists. As although Morris had possessed a keen social conscience, it was perhaps his close proximity to the deprivation he was surrounded by in Hammersmith that prompted him to concentrate his political activities. He told an audience in 1881, "As I sit and work at home, I hear the yells and shrieks. It was my good luck only of being born respectable and rich that has put me on this side of the window among delightful books and lovely works of art, and not on the other side, in the empty street, the drink-steeped liquor shops, the foul and degraded lodgings." In 1883, Morris joined the Social Democratic Federation and later the Socialist League. The coach house was converted yet again, this time to become a lecture room for the Hammersmith branch of the Socialist League. And the branch continued to meet in the coach house throughout Morris's lifetime. And some of the most influential minds of the time gave lectures on Sunday evenings at Kelmscott House. So apart from Morris himself, speakers included George Bernard Shaw, Keir Hardie, Peter Kropotkin and Annie Besant. And Gustav Holst would later write his Hammersmith Prelude in memory of his time spent with socialist colleagues. Morris's last great undertaking, what he called his little typographical adventure, was the establishment of his own private printing press in 1891. A few doors away, the press helped to start the private press movement. Morris designed his own typefaces, used the blackest ink and the best quality handmade paper. The press issued 52 books, and the crowning glory was the Kelmscott Chaucer, which was published in 1896 and contained 87 illustrations designed by Burne-Jones. When Morris's health began failing, he asked his partners to continue after his death. However, it was eventually agreed that it would be wiser to close the press in its glory. After all, Morris was the Kelmscott Press. One of the Albion presses used at the Kelmscott Press is now in the Society's collection and is on permanent display in the basement at Kelmscott House. But of course, it wasn't only William Morris who lived at this beautiful riverside home at this time. His wife Jane was a talented embroiderer, and their daughters Jenny and May also lived at Kelmscott House. May was a talented designer, jeweller and weaver, taking over the embroidery department of Morris and Company at just 23 years old. She went on to edit 24 volumes of her father's work and upheld his legacy. And here we have May's watercolour of her mother in the drawing room at Kelmscott House. However, the women of the Morris family are the subject of another talk in their own right, and there's no time really to go into detail of them this morning. So following Morris's death, Jane continued to live at Kelmscott House until 1897. She then moved permanently to Kelmscott Manor, taking most of the contents from the London residence with her. And then Henry Curry Marillier, managing director of the Merton Abbey Tapestry Works, bought the lease in late November 1897. And then Warwick Draper, a barrister, local historian and self-taught artist, took over the house from Marillier, living there from 1910 until 1915. Draper was a leading figure in a range of voluntary and political activities in Hammersmith and Chiswick. And along with Hilary Pepler and Fred Rowntree, he founded the Hampshire House Club in 1905. The club was intended to provide opportunities for cultural improvement, including art and craft workshops for the working people of Hammersmith. It was situated between the slums and Kelmscott House. And among those enlisted to help the club with various ways were G.K. Chesterton, Hilaire Belloc, and William Rothenstein. During World War I, as an offshoot from the club, they developed the Hampshire House workshops in Hampshire Hog Lane. Pepler, Rowntree and Draper founded these workshops to give employment to Belgian and other war refugees. One of the many projects undertaken by Hampshire House during the war was the establishment of the Hampshire House Bakery in Dove's Place, providing employment for Belgian refugees. And Eric Gill sculpted the limestone statue in 1916 for the Hampshire House. And he also designed this striking woodcut for the shop's paper bags. Sadly, Warwick Draper fell to his death from a balcony in 1926. This same year, Mrs. Helena Stevenson and her husband Morton purchased the house in 1926, thereby saving it from partial demolition. Mrs. Stevenson was a keen Morrisian, collector and friend of May Morris. She was to remain in occupation until her death in 1972. It was Mrs. Stevenson who bequeathed Kelmscott House to the William Morris Society. There was just one condition she put on that very generous bequest, and that was subject to the continuing occupation of the coach house tenants for life, because Mrs. Stevenson lived in the main part of Kelmscott House, and the actress Athene Saylor lived in the coach house from 1964 until her death in 1990. Athene Saylor had known and worked with a wealth of actors throughout her long life, including Henry Irving, Mrs. Patrick Campbell, and Ellen Terry, as well as with the playwright George Bernard Shaw, who she described as a dear man, although we disagreed over an exit I had to make in one of his plays. When given the house, I think the society probably thought it wouldn't be too long before the coach house where Athene lived would become available, because when the society took the house on, Athene lived in the coach house, but she was a very elderly lady at that point, and the society was quite keen on having the coach house available with all historic associations for visitors to see. But she went on to live until she was 101 years old. And Athene actually celebrated her 101st birthday at her Hammersmith home. And one of the journalists who attended her party asked her what the secret was to her long life. And Athene replied, "It's the observation of what she called her 4 nevers. I have never cut my hair, never had a car, never worn trousers, and never said okay." This striking portrait of Athene was painted by June Crisfield Chapman and is now part of the Society's collection, and it represents an important person who lived in the house. And when Athene died, then the Society did have access to the whole of the house. And the William Morris Centre was officially opened by the Prime Minister at the time, Sir Harold Wilson, and Sir Basil Blackwell in 1976. It provided accommodation for visiting students and ran for 5 years. Many of those resident students are now leading Morrisian experts. The centre, though, was forced to close due to financial difficulties. There had been no endowment fund. The upper floors of the house were then leased after much dispute and the failure of a compulsory purchase order in 1982. Christopher Hampton, the playwright, lived here, and Faye Dunaway was interested at one point in buying the lease. However, although the main part of the house became residential in the 80s, the lower floors and the coach house remained in the Society's possession as they do today, and they were open to the public in 1987. And the lower part of the house became an accredited museum in 2001. The upper floors continue to be residential, although sometimes there is an opportunity to visit the main Morris rooms as part of the open house celebrations, but that's obviously all stopped now because of lockdown. And it's just a fascinating house to visit, though, and we do have a film at the Society that shows the rooms as Morris lived them when he lived there. Some lovely archival photographs taken by Emery Walker of the house. Throughout its 230-year history, Kelmscott House has proved inspirational to electrical engineers, artists, designers, historians, playwrights, and actresses. This has been the story of a remarkable house with an extraordinary number of remarkable residents. Well, thank you very much for listening, and I do hope you'll join us for our talk next month. Our talk for October is in memory of Morris, and that's commemorating Morris's anniversary. And so we'll be looking at some of the Society's collection of obituaries of Morris. So I do hope you can join us then, again on the 3rd Tuesday. And I'd just like to thank you all for joining us today, and for, as ever, your support of the William Morris Society, which is greatly appreciated. Thank you again, and hope to see you again soon.